Centuries of entrenched racism have fostered a significant wealth divide in America between black and white citizens. In her recent article for the New York Times, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones asserts that if true justice and equality are ever to be realized in the U.S., the country must finally acknowledge its obligations to Black Americans. MSNBC correspondent Trymaine Lee interviewed Hannah-Jones for his latest Into America podcast, focused on reparations. Trymaine joins me now. What factors did Nikole mention that contribute to this racial wealth gap? Hey, Allison. Beyond just contributions, the source of the wealth gap traces back to shortly after emancipation, when formerly enslaved individuals were released into society with nothing, starting from scratch. Despite government promises of restitution in the form of 40 acres and a mule, those commitments were never fulfilled. Instead, former plantation owners were returned their land. Following that, a long history of Jim Crow laws, restricted job access, depressed housing prices, and more continued to exacerbate the situation from emancipation through the 1950s and 60s. Factors like the violent dispossession of wealth, the destruction of Black Wall Street, and the systematic looting of Black communities meant that land and resources were never returned. So how do we start bridging the gap between Black and white Americans? And what would closing that gap mean for Black Americans regarding their futures and economic stability? A significant issue has been that Black individuals have struggled to build and pass down wealth like buying a home and bequeathing it to their children. Nikole Hannah-Jones contends that the only viable solution is restitution or reparations. Imagine this. Tomorrow, the United States announces that every Black American is entitled to $151 million in reparations, not merely a symbolic gesture, but real wealth that could transform lives. Sounds like a dream, right? By the end of this video, you'll see why this possibility is real and why every Black American should never have to pay taxes again. Yes, you heard that correctly, never pay taxes again. Stay with me as we explore the numbers, history, and moral arguments, all supporting this case. Right now, the median wealth of a white family in America is nearly 8 times that of a Black family. This isn't just a gap, it's a chasm. This disparity is no accident. It results from centuries of systemic exploitation, beginning with slavery and persisting through Jim Crow laws, redlining, and ongoing discriminatory practices. But what if we could rewrite that narrative? What if every Black American could attain the financial freedom they deserve? Welcome to The Chronicles of Blacks, a channel dedicated to exploring the rich tapestry of Black history. Please subscribe as we continue our quest for justice. Here's the stark reality. Reparations are not just a moral obligation. They are a financial necessity. Let's break this down. The total economic value of the labor exploited during slavery is estimated at around $16.2 trillion in today's dollars. This doesn't even factor in the generational wealth lost to segregation, discriminatory lending, and economic disenfranchisement. Reparations could bridge the racial wealth gap almost instantly, addressing the long-standing economic harm inflicted on Black Americans for generations. Here's where it becomes truly compelling. By the end of this video, you'll understand why reparations of this scale could mean that Black Americans should never pay another cent in taxes. Consider this. If the government owes you $151 million, how could they justifiably tax you on top of that? The figures don't lie. What Black Americans are owed significantly surpasses any taxes they have paid or will ever pay throughout their lives. Before we dive into the tax implications, let's discuss why this issue is urgent. During the Jim Crow era, Black Americans were deliberately excluded from programs like the GI Bill, which enabled millions of white families to buy homes and build generational wealth. Additionally, Black farmers lost an estimated 90% of their land due to discriminatory lending practices and outright theft. These were not isolated events. They were part of a calculated system of economic disadvantage. For instance, redlining denying Black, Families based on their neighborhoods not only barred access to homeownership, but robbed entire communities of wealth-building opportunities. Today, Black families are far less likely to own homes, meaning they miss out on one of the most significant sources of generational wealth in America. Yet, despite this, Black Americans have contributed billions in taxes to a system that has historically worked against them. This is why reparations are not merely about financial compensation. They represent justice. They acknowledge that the economic inequality we observe today is a direct result of policies designed to oppress, aiming to create a level playing field for all Black Americans to thrive. Imagine the potential. $151 million in reparations could provide financial freedom for millions, enabling homeownership, education, entrepreneurship, and investments in future generations. And consider this: if the U.S. government can allocate trillions for wars, bailouts for corporations, and tax breaks for billionaires, why can't it find the funds to repay its debts to Black Americans? More importantly, how can we ensure this conversation evolves from hypothetical to reality? By the end of this video, you will grasp not just why reparations are necessary, but how they could reshape America permanently. You'll see why, after everything Black Americans have endured, the obligation to pay taxes should be off the table until the debt is settled in full. This case for reparations is more than rectifying historical wrongs. It's about addressing a financial imbalance that Black Americans have carried for generations. However, there's a compelling twist. Reparations could exempt Black Americans from taxes altogether. Let's break this down. Currently, Black households contribute billions annually to federal, state, and local taxes. Recent studies show that Black taxpayers contribute 13.8% of all federal income taxes, even while earning significantly less than their white counterparts. A population historically excluded from wealth-building opportunities is disproportionately funding a system that has worked against them for centuries. Now, let's analyze this through the lens of reparations. If each Black American were entitled to $151 million in reparations, the government would effectively owe them far more than they have ever paid or will pay in taxes. If a typical Black household pays around $10,000 annually in federal and state taxes, over a lifetime, that might total $400,000 to $500. Zero. Still minuscule compared to the $151 million owed in reparations. The numbers clearly indicate that Black Americans are not just taxpayers, they are creditors, and the debt owed to them is real, quantifiable, and long overdue. But the argument goes deeper than mere figures. Taxes are meant to fund services that benefit those who contribute. For centuries, however, Black Americans have been taxed to support systems that actively excluded or oppressed them. Take, for example, the Jim Crow era, when Black Americans paid taxes like everyone else, but were barred from accessing the very schools, hospitals, and public services their taxes funded. Much of the infrastructure in the South was financed with tax dollars from Black citizens who were denied the ability to use those facilities. This is not just inequality, it is theft. The injustices didn't stop with Jim Crow. Today, Black Americans still face systemic barriers that devalue their tax contributions. For instance, due to redlining and segregation, Black families often reside in areas with lower property values, resulting in underfunded schools fueled by property taxes. This perpetuates a cycle where Black children are systematically deprived of the same educational opportunities as their white peers, despite their families paying similar or higher tax rates in some cases. Then, consider the criminal justice system. Black Americans are overtaxed to fund police departments, courts, and prisons, while being over-policed, over-prosecuted, and over-incarcerated. For example, in Ferguson, Missouri, over 20% of the city's budget came from fines and court fees disproportionately levied on Black residents, essentially forcing Black Americans to finance a system that criminalizes their existence. Now, let's circle back to reparations. If the government recognizes its debt to Black Americans stemming from centuries of exploitation and systemic racism, how can it justify taxing them? Here's a thought. If America can afford to grant massive tax cuts to billionaires and corporations, why can't it afford to exempt Black Americans owed reparations? The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act alone cost the U.S. government over $1.5 trillion in lost revenue, primarily benefiting the wealthiest Americans. Compare this to the estimated $10 to $12 trillion cost of reparations, and the math is clear. The resources exist. It's merely a matter of priorities. Finally, let's discuss fairness. Some might argue that exempting Black Americans from taxes is unfair to other groups, but let's be clear. Fairness isn't about treating everyone the same. It's about addressing ingrained inequalities. Reparations and tax exemptions are not special treatment. They are overdue justice. To sum it up, Black Americans have been compelled to contribute to a system that has historically exploited and excluded them. Reparations aren't just about balancing the scales. They are about acknowledging the truth and beginning to repair the damage. Until that debt is fully repaid, asking Black Americans to pay taxes is nothing short of adding insult to injury. The numbers don't lie, and neither does history. Reparations are not merely necessary. They are a moral and financial imperative. If the government is earnest about justice, it must recognize that Black Americans should not be burdened with the costs of a system that still owes them so much. To understand why reparations are not only justified but essential, we must revisit one of the most damaging eras in American history, the Jim Crow era. This time saw laws that were not merely racist, but economic tools designed to keep Black Americans in a perpetual state of poverty. These laws stripped away opportunities and systematically stole wealth from Black communities, and their effects are still felt today. Let's break it down. During the Jim Crow era, Black Americans were systematically denied access to the fundamental elements of economic success. Land ownership, for example, is one of the most reliable paths to building wealth. But for Black Americans, it was often an unattainable dream. By the early 20th century, Black farmers owned over 16 million acres of land. But due to discriminatory lending practices, legal loopholes, and outright violence, Black land ownership dwindled to less than 2 million acres by the century's end. This was no coincidence. It was a coordinated effort to strip Black Americans of their wealth. Then there was housing. The Federal Housing Administration, established in the 1930s, aimed to make homeownership accessible to more Americans. However, through a process known as redlining, the FHA refused to insure mortgages in predominantly Black neighborhoods. This meant that Black families could not access the low-interest loans that allowed millions of white families to purchase homes and build wealth. Even worse, Black families who managed to buy homes often saw their property values intentionally devalued simply due to their race. Over decades, this cost Black families an estimated $156 billion in lost equity money that should have been passed down to future generations. Education was another area where Jim Crow laws inflicted lasting economic harm. Black schools were chronically underfunded, receiving only a fraction of the resources allocated to white schools. This was not mere neglect. It was a deliberate strategy to deny Black children the education necessary to compete in the workforce. Even when Black families paid taxes to support public education, those dollars were funneled into schools that excluded their children. As a result, generations of Black Americans were locked out of higher-paying jobs and career opportunities. But economic oppression didn't end with education. After World War II, programs like the GI Bill helped millions of veterans buy homes, start businesses, and attend college. However, Black veterans were largely excluded from these benefits. Southern officials ensured that Black soldiers returning from war were denied access to the programs they had fought to earn, depriving Black families of the chance to use these benefits to build wealth, while white families leveraged them to ascend into the middle class. Even Black entrepreneurs faced systemic barriers. Many cities enacted laws restricting Black-owned businesses from operating in certain areas, cutting them off from lucrative markets. When Black businesses thrived despite these obstacles, they were often targeted for destruction. One notorious example is the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, during which a prosperous black community known as Black Wall Street was obliterated by a white mob in a single night, resulting in hundreds of lost lives and an estimated $200 million in today's dollars vanishing. And let's not overlook the criminal justice system during the Jim Crow era. Black Americans were disproportionately arrested and convicted for minor or fabricated offenses, often sentenced to hard labor in prison camps. This wasn't merely punishment, it was profit. The convict leasing system allowed states to lease incarcerated black men to private companies, essentially continuing the practice of slavery under a different name. This forced labor denied black men their freedom and stripped their families of economic stability. These injustices weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic effort to maintain white supremacy by keeping black Americans economically disadvantaged. Although the Jim Crow era officially ended with the civil rights movement, its legacy persists today. Black Americans still confront significant barriers to wealth building, from discriminatory lending practices to wage gaps and employment discrimination. The racial wealth gap we see today is not an accident. It is the direct outcome of policies designed to create and maintain inequality. Now, let's draw parallels to today's reality. While Jim Crow laws are no longer in effect, their impact remains visible in the policies and practices that continue to disadvantage black Americans. For instance, predatory lending disproportionately targets black borrowers, charging them higher interest rates and fees than their white counterparts, even when their credit profiles are similar. This has resulted in black families losing billions in wealth through foreclosures and excessive interest payments. Wage inequality is another area where the legacy of Jim Crow persists. On average, black workers earn about 75 cents for every dollar earned by white workers, with an even wider gap for black women. This disparity is not merely about individual paychecks. It represents a lifetime of lost earnings, reduced retirement savings, and diminished opportunities for future generations. Even in the realm of taxation, disparities are glaring. Black Americans are more likely to face audits and penalties from the IRS, despite earning less than white taxpayers. In some states, black homeowners pay higher property taxes than white homeowners in similar neighborhoods, meaning black families are not only earning less, but also contributing more to a system that continues to work against them. What does all this imply for reparations? It signifies that the debt owed to black Americans is not solely about slavery. It is about the cumulative impact of centuries of systemic oppression from Jim Crow to contemporary discrimination. Reparations are not merely about making amends for the past. They address the present. They recognize that the economic harm inflicted on black Americans did not cease with slavery. It evolved and continues today. This is why reparations must be comprehensive. They cannot simply be a one-time payment. They should encompass structural changes to rectify the systemic inequalities that still exist, acknowledging that the economic debt owed to black Americans far surpasses any taxes they have ever paid. Until this debt is settled in full, expecting black Americans to contribute to a system that has historically excluded them is not only unjust, it is immoral. The essence of the matter is this: the legacy of Jim Crow is not merely history, it is an ongoing reality. Reparations are about more than just monetary compensation. They are about justice, acknowledging wrongs, and creating a future where black Americans can finally build the wealth and opportunities that have been unjustly denied to them for far too long. It is time for America to confront this truth and take action. The conversation about reparations extends beyond merely addressing the past. It involves taking decisive steps to rectify centuries of systemic injustice. But beyond moral arguments, there is a practical one. Reparations are not just the right thing to do, they are the smart thing to do. By addressing the racial wealth gap, America can not only make amends for its past, but also forge a stronger, more equitable future. Let's explore the rationale for reparations and why they should come with tax exemptions for Black Americans. First, the moral argument is irrefutable. For centuries, Black Americans have been exploited, excluded, and oppressed. Yet they have continued to contribute to the nation's economic growth, from unpaid labor during slavery to paying taxes into systems that exclude them. Black Americans have given far more to this country than they have received in return. Reparations are not charity. They are justice. They recognize that the wealth and power of the United States were largely built on the backs of enslaved Africans and their descendants. However, morality alone is insufficient for effecting change. So let's discuss the economic argument. If implemented correctly, reparations would inject trillions of dollars into the economy, benefiting not just Black Americans, but the nation as a whole. Imagine millions of Black families suddenly having the financial means to buy homes, start businesses, and invest in education. The ripple effects would be transformative. $151 million each in reparations. How can it justify continuing to tax them? The logic is straightforward. Until the debt is fully repaid, Black Americans should not have to contribute to a system that has historically worked against them. This is not merely about fairness, it is about accountability. By exempting Black Americans from taxes, the government acknowledges that their financial contributions have already surpassed their fair share, serving as a tangible way to begin repairing the economic damage caused by centuries of systemic racism. Consider the implications for Black families. The average American pays roughly 30% of their income in taxes. For Black Americans, eliminating this tax burden would free up billions of dollars annually, funds that could be reinvested into Black-owned businesses, used to pay off debts, or saved for future generations. Essentially, a tax exemption is not merely a financial relief. It is an empowerment tool, granting Black Americans the resources to build wealth on their terms. Let's not forget the historical context. For centuries, Black Americans have been compelled to pay into systems that excluded or actively harmed them. During the Jim Crow era, Black taxpayers funded schools, hospitals, and public infrastructure they were barred from using. Even today, Black communities are disproportionately taxed through practices like predatory fines and fees, all while receiving fewer resources in return. A tax exemption acknowledges this history and begins to level the playing field. Beyond the economic and moral arguments lies a larger question. What kind of society do we want to become? Reparations and tax exemptions are not simply about rectifying past injustices. They are about creating a future where justice and equality are not just ideals, but realities. They aim to establish a society where everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, regardless of race or background. They demonstrate to the world that America is willing to confront its past in order to build a better future. In summary, reparations are about more than just money. They are about acknowledging the truth, repairing harm, and creating a future in which Black Americans can finally thrive. A tax exemption is not merely a financial benefit. It is a statement affirming the commitment to addressing historical injustices. Now, it is up to us to keep this conversation alive. Reparations and tax exemptions will not materialize overnight, but change begins with awareness and action. If this video resonates with you, here's how you can help. Share it with friends and family. Engage in discussions about the significance of reparations, and most importantly, make your voice heard. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to The Chronicles of Blacks for more in-depth explorations of issues that matter. Together, we can cultivate the awareness needed to drive change. Repaying this debt isn't just morally right. It's a matter of national integrity. Logic dictates that if you owe someone money, you don't turn around and demand they pay you more. Instead, you settle the debt. Exempting Black Americans from taxes until reparations are fulfilled isn't merely a financial argument, it's a moral one. Acknowledging that Black Americans' contributions to this nation have far exceeded their fair share, from the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans that built America's wealth to the taxes they have paid into systems that have historically excluded them.